Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. As you probably know by now, we have an ongoing saga of the background, theories of, understanding of, hopefully knowing what's going on of, and suggestive corrections and treatments of cancer, or something to that effect. Anyhow, we are going to continue our discussion today. Now, we had gotten a little bit into some of the theories of the cause, and generally, traditional medicine has certain ideas. Theirs mostly falling under mutations caused by toxic or disturbing substances leading to what they call carcinogenesis, blaming it on toxins and so forth, and or genetic variants, and or in some cases suggested viruses. And now, with a lot of the new information that's coming out, they're talking a bit about epigenetics and how that might play a part. In general, the concepts have run pretty consistent over time, unless you go way back all the way for several hundred years and talk about the black bile being the basic cause. There's been a lot of suggestions. Now, some of those suggestions, of course, are based on some theoretical findings, but at this point, I think it's still up in the air. There's billions of dollars been invested in research attempting to pinpoint exactly what the cause is. And I think as we get through this discussion, it may end up that it's not quite that simple. Now, you know that they are always looking for the one cause, a la Pasteur's idea of one germ causing one disease with one cure. Made it a very simple formula. And medicine has kind of maintained that over the years. They would like to isolate everything down to one single cause, a bug of some sort if possible, and therefore we just give you a poison to poison out the bug and everything will be fine. As of yet, of course, that hasn't happened with cancer, and so we see all of these marches and walks and runs and buying things and et cetera, to raise more money. And all of this money raising, of course, we find that in the meantime the incidence of cancer is increasing, and we're finding that it's no better off than it's been. Now, we're not going to get into the numbers so much this time in terms of claims by medicine about how much better things are getting. But we will be throwing some information in there that shows you how skillfully they utilize certain numbers and very skillfully ignore other numbers, kind of like misdirection. You look at this and that sounds great, but don't worry about the fact that such and such. And I'm going to get into it in more detail as we get into the therapeutic side of this. We're still talking about the theoretical side, and therefore we still have a lot to go before we get into the therapeutics. Now, what you will see down the road is that the therapeutics, of course, are going to be based on the assumptions related to causes. So if you think that a particular thing causes cancer, then that could be a basis for your therapy to offset the effects of whatever it is they feel the cause is. And you're going to find some interesting ones. Maybe you've already heard them. It's hard to say at this point. With the internet, a lot more information is out there, and people are becoming better educated, which I'm in favor of, because I think the best possible thing you can arm yourself with is the fact that the more you know, the better qualified you will be to make a really informed decision, especially if you are facing this kind of problem. And I mentioned earlier, at least on one or two occasions, maybe more, that a good book that you should be really considering is one called Cancer Then Healing. 15 Decisions to Make When You or a Loved One Are Told You Have Cancer or Any Life-Threatening Disease by Mickey Vassard. And basically what she's saying is don't get in shock, don't agree to everything, and turn your body over to somebody else and just sit back and see what happens, which is what happens to so many people. They're so scared and so fearful that when they receive that kind of a diagnosis, then they want to jump and run real fast to the nearest chemical, radiation, knife, whatever it is that they think is going to rid them of this dreaded problem, and basically may not be the best decision to make. So, it's a good book to read, and it really just says, take a deep breath and kind of see where you are before you jump and run with it. So, also I want to mention again, the book actually compiled by a gentleman by the name of Burton Goldberg, a retired businessman who has spent the last several years encouraging and looking for other approaches to the problem of cancer, and he has kind of put together, based on two doctors, Dr. John Diamond and Dr. W. Lee Cowden, what they have done is gone out and looked at everything that's out there and put them in, introducing the person involved, the reason behind the therapy, the effectiveness of the therapy, and so forth. Now, this is subtitled Cancer Can Be Reversed. This book tells how, using clinically proven complementary and alternative therapies. Very good book to get. There's a lot of material in there, but would certainly be worthwhile if you're faced with dealing with the issue. And before it's done, we'll give you some other resources also. And I held up this huge notebook that's about 3 inches thick, that is basically another really late upgrade of something called Outsmart Your Cancer, Alternative Non-Toxic Treatments that Work. And so those are things that have been compiled here of late. Some will be duplicated from the other cancer book I just mentioned, but a lot of these are going to be up to date, the latest out there. In fact, it should be right up to current today. That's available that you can look into for yourself or someone you know if cancer is a problem. So the whole purpose of this broadcast is to inform you, show you first of all that it's not so simplistic or cut and dried as you might led to be believe that it's that simple. It's not, and you're going to find even the diagnosis is not going to be that simple. That in fact that it's not always that clear cut exactly what is going on. In other words, do you really have cancer? Do you have cellular dysplasia? Do you have an inner growth, or what is it? And we'll be covering that before this is over, but you're going to find it's not quite that simple. And in fact, you're probably going to be surprised about a lot of things that you hear that you normally don't hear. So, we know that then, based on what we just said, that traditional medicine has done their traditional therapies for years, and even though billions of dollars have been invested into cancer research, as of today, after years and years, or actually decades, they have been unable to tell you really what is the problem that causes cancer and what is really an effective way to get rid of it. And of course, they always make a war out of it. We're always talking about the war on cancer, or this person lost their battle with cancer. And I think that putting it in warring terms makes it more powerful than it is if you have a better understanding. In fact, probably some of the most powerful therapies are going to be minuscule in cost compared to some of the high-powered therapies that are used out there, and some of the adjunctive things that really don't contribute to the therapy, in fact, are trying to deal with the side effect of the therapy and may even make the cancer grow faster and be worse. So we'll be talking about that too. I want you to have as complete a picture as we can. Now this is the 4th broadcast in this series, and I know there's going to be at least one more, and possibly 2. It'll be the longest one I've done, the way it's looking, but there's a tremendous amount there, and the problem has gotten worse. If it were getting better, it wouldn't be so bad, but the number of people that are getting cancer and diagnosed with it is getting worse. And even though, contrary to you hearing that we have a higher survival rate for the 5-year period following diagnosis, you're going to find that the death rate is the same. In other words, the people are going to die from the cancer the same. The only difference is if you discover it sooner, then you're going to live with it longer, you're going to be treated more for it and put out more money, and in the long run you're going to die at the same rate you would have had it not happen. So that's where the numbers are kind of misleading, and we'll get into that in more detail, but just to throw that out to you, that the death rate is no better, and the fact is that more and more people are actually developing cancer, and there's a lot of reasons why that's happening. So we're going to get into some of those. Now, we talked about Otto Warburg last session, and his work with the oxygen deprivation, or hypoxia, causing a cell to become a malignant, well, at least a cancerous cell, not necessarily malignant, maybe so. You know, that's a little fuzzy on the definitions, but the fact is that it alters the metabolism of a cell if it's exposed to lack of oxygen, and if it gets down to about 35% for very long, you probably cannot reverse the cell. And what you would have to do is to encourage it to die off, because it's a defective cell, and as it wears out and dies off, you're finished with it, and that you don't keep generating new ones. And so that would be the outcome of that. Now, some people think that oxygen is the total cause, and therefore, since it's the total cause, then all you have to do is supply oxygen and everything will be great. So that's what we'll find out on the therapeutic side. Now, as I said last time, Warburg's work kind of is in the middle, because it's known about and accepted by regular medicine, it's known about and accepted by alternative medicine. The difference being, okay, what do you do with it now that you have it? Now, as I say, I think the cell becomes altered metabolic, whether it starts replicating, and see, that's another issue. And when it's replicating out of control, there's something else going on, and I think that is, to me, the problem with saying that lack of oxygen is the total problem. I don't believe that it is. However, both sides recognize that it is a problem, and so in that respect, that's good. At least there's some common ground. There is a lot of, in alternative field, people that are using that as the sole cause, and therefore they've come up with a therapy which they feel is going to take care of it in every case, which really doesn't happen. And I'm not going to be overly optimistic in the sense that I'm going to say everything alternative is great and everything traditional is no good. What we want to do is to see what is best and what can potentially be done between the two in many cases, depending on how far down the road it is. The other thing you're going to find out is that you're probably going to have to alter the therapeutic approach depending on how advanced the cancer is. So if you're talking about one that's at the beginning, or the one that has progressed, or one that is now spread throughout the whole body, we're going to be talking different approaches to each of those, or to somehow intervene. And that will be probably in the last session. We'll get into the therapeutic and or resources for cancer. So the other thing that I did notice that there is, or at least was, some commonality, which at this point it's not so big, except that you hear some talk about it within traditional medicine in terms of prevention, which is about the only thing that I've seen coming out of regular medicine that they even talk about prevention, and that has to do with nutrition as a prevention, and I'm sure you've heard them talk about different type of vegetables and fruits. If you ate so many a day, that could potentially prevent the formation of cancer. Many years ago, I think I mentioned it, there was this book written called the Dietitis or Diaitis on the natural defense of the human body, and this was done back many years ago, about 1961, and what happened was it was found that by correcting diet, people that had developed cancer got better or even got rid of it. And so this was when medicine didn't have as many of the powerful chemotherapies as they do now, and a lot of the approaches they use now. So they were looking into this. However, it ended up in my mind, there was no great money into having people correct their diet. So consequently, they kind of lost interest in it, and it seemed to fall by the wayside. So what happened is that the alternative people picked up heavily on nutrition, and that became one of their primaries. So some of the earliest work with cancer from the alternative side, it was and is in the nutritional deficiency side. So that if you're missing certain nutrients, the chances are that you are at risk for developing some mutant cells, and from those mutant cells, you then are in the position to develop a runaway malignant cell, overly proliferating and leading to a tumor or a spread of cancer throughout the body. So the nutritional, I would say, is the basic mainstay, and unfortunately, it's not that simple. The problem with the nutrition today is that we have difficulty getting good food, period. Now, I'm convinced, and I've heard doctors say this, medical doctors, over time, if you ate a good balanced diet, you would not need to take supplements and you wouldn't have all these problems. And that would be correct if we had good food. But it was known, and I have a copy of a presentation that was made before the U.S. Congress back in 1936-7 era, where already it was known that the soil was deficient in minerals and people were developing all kinds of serious illnesses because of those deficiencies. Now that was in the 30s that was happening, and in fact there was an article written in one of the major magazines talking about miracle doctors, and these miracle doctors were doctors that were starting to utilize supplementation. So if you know much about the history, and maybe you don't, of nutritional application in terms of therapeutics, Dr. Royal Lee, a dentist up in Wisconsin, actually is probably the leader in nutritional therapies in this country. And so he recognized way back in the 30s, early 30s actually, that there was a big problem with nutrition already. And so here we are, almost a century after that, and we still not only have not solved the problem is worse than before. Because in the 1960s, the Department of Agriculture ran a analytical study of the commercial nutrients or foods that were on the market looking for nutrients, and they found that in the 60s, already we only had half as many nutrients in the food being grown under current conditions as there was in the 30s. In the 30s it was already deficient, and by the 60s only half of that amount. And now in the last 3, 4, 5 years they've started running some of the foods again, and they're now finding that between 1966 and now that they're actually almost another 50% less on the average. So now we're talking, it was 50% less in the 60s, which was already low in the 30s, and now we're 50% lower than the 60s. So that means there's hardly anything in the food anymore, which seems to be about right. What's happened is that they've ruined the soil, they've overgrown on it, and they've used artificial fertilizers, and that's saying nothing of the pesticides and other contaminants have gotten in the food. And so it's created a tremendously bad situation, and the body has to have key nutrients if it's going to work right. And so I can see where this came about, that the nutritional deficiency would be a major problem in malignancy or cancer, and that correction of those would be an important step. Now, my suspicion is that way back when food still had a lot of nutrients, good nutrients, that food made a tremendous difference. In fact, people probably did, as is mentioned in the book on the diet, that correcting the nutrition was able to help the people get rid of problems. But today, as I have determined, this has become kind of a big interest of mine about the quality of food. And what I noted was that when I was growing up in West Virginia many, many years ago, that the food that we grew tasted a certain way because it was grown in good soil with good minerals present in the soil. And the food tasted like food, and of course they didn't have all the pesticides when I was real young growing up, and all the chemical additives. So basically, if they were going to fertilize, they used manure or compost or some type of products to enhance the soil, and they used crop rotations. They used a lot of different things that made it very, very beneficial, and the quality of the food was getting up there. And so I was used to a different type of food. Well, I've noticed, there's been a move to get back to organic growing, which is great, because organic growing means that they're not going to be adding artificial fertilizers, and they're not going to be using the synthetic herbicides, pesticides, all these chemicals that the modern growing is exposed to. To say nothing of genetically modified, which at this point we won't get into heavily, other than to say this is another major problem because of the modification of the foods. Genetically, they've been programmed to grow pesticides from the genes of the plant to keep away the bugs, but on the other hand, the big problem is that you're going to be eating it. So that is not so good. And so the contaminants have come to the foreground as being a major problem, because when you test, and we're going to be talking about one of the tests that was developed in Europe, they don't do it here, called an Nakano test, that can tell in a few minutes whether any substance is carcinogenic, which means that it alters the DNA to the point that it causes the cell to start replicating without control. And so what happened is I've bought organic products and I've taken them, brought them home, and when I bit into whether it was a peach, a nectarine, an apple, whatever, I found that it tastes like there was nothing there but fiber and coloring. And so what's happening is people are being deceived when they buy organic grown food because it's certified organic, which only attests to the method that was used to grow it, not to the condition of the soil. And so then by the time you get the food, the problem is that there is no nutrient value. And that's what I was finding out. Now, there is a way to test that, and at some point when we're talking about eating and growing and whatever, which we will be, we'll talk about how you can monitor the quality of the food. If you went into a grocery store and you wanted to buy peaches, how you could determine if that peach had a high level of nutrients in it, or whether it was nothing but fiber grown in poor soil and being able to be certified as organic but having no nutrient value. So there's a way to test that, and we'll talk about that at the right time. So I can see that if nutritional deficiency is your theory as to why you have malignancy, then correcting that could go a big step forward therapeutically, and that's why you would want to do that. My experience is that today, the way the nutrition is, that is not enough. That it does not do the job because people are too deficient, and it's not in the food, and so it's not enough and way too late in most cases, to make a big difference. Now, that's not to say that I don't want you to change your nutrition. I do. I want you to be able to eat good food that is going to supply all the things you need. Now, I found out a few years ago that first of all, everybody that was coming into my clinic, I used to test them for body temperature, oxygen saturation of the blood, blood pressure, and weight, and etc., a whole group of things. And what I was noticing consistently was that everybody we measured had low body temperature. And I wondered if that was some fluke or if there was a problem with the instrument. But as time went on, I, in double checking, found that no, that was not the problem. The problem is that people are running low body temperature. And it ended up that ultimately I looked different directions. I looked at the thyroid issue and different approaches utilizing thyroid. And I eventually even did a lot of analysis of people for something called iodine saturation. And bottom line was, I found that everybody that I tested, and I tested a huge number, and another doctor I know tested around 3,000 people, and found that only 1 in 3,000 had a decent amount of iodine. The rest of the people were anywhere from highly deficient to grossly deficient in saturation of iodine. Now, most people associate iodine only with the thyroid, where in fact it's necessary for every cell in the body, and it's necessary especially in large amounts for the thyroid, and also for the breast tissue in both men and women, and also for the ovarian tissue and prostate tissue in men. It's a tremendous protector that if you are missing iodine, you're going to be prone to, women will be fibrocystic breast, ovarian cysts, and men, all kinds of problems with the prostate and so forth. And of course, now even a lot more men are developing breast cancer. So it's a protection against all those. So it means that it's not just some that you need for the thyroid, but for all these other tissues in large amounts. Plus the fact that every cell in the body requires it. So that's just an example that if that's not present in the soil and not present in the food, therefore, it's going to be deficient in your body. And there's a cofactor that runs with that, which is selenomethionine, which is selenium, an element, in the form of a methionated molecule, meaning that L-methionine, one of the amino acids, is added to it. And those two are extremely important in the cell metabolism. And I noted that when I increased the iodine tremendously over what the recommended dose is, that the person's body temperature would come back up, and as it came back up, their energy would improve and they would feel better in all respects. And so that's just one case where I know that if you're low in those, that your likelihood of developing cancer is much greater. So at least in those tissues, but it's also in all the cells, because then the cells cannot detox properly. Now you need to understand that when the cell is beginning to wear out, there's going to come a point when it is not going to function properly. And so if iodine is present along with the selenium, which is a very powerful antioxidant, if those are present, when that cell starts to wear out, it will in turn trigger a replication of the DNA to form a new cell, and then they divide apart, and then the old cell actually slows down and dies off. Now that's a natural process called apoptosis, and if the body has the iodine, it can carry that out properly, and if it doesn't, instead of replicating, it just grows weaker and weaker until it can go into a state of senescence and therefore be pretty useless for the body. And also, in my mind, it also can become a malignant tissue under the right conditions, that being one. So what you're going to see is I'm going to be presenting that there's different things that come together that contribute to the development of cancer, and it's like most problems in the body is not a single cause. Much as the regular medical establishment would love that to be, and as much as Pasteur thought he had found the secret, one germ, one disease, one cure. That's not the case. That it's going to be complex, and therefore that's why the therapies, depending on how far along it's gotten, are probably going to be different if you're really going to do an effective job. So nutrition deficiencies, especially from the alternative side, and at one time started to go that direction from the regular medicine side, ended up, as I say, they quit being so bothered with it, except now they do talk about it a little bit in terms of prevention. The next thing that I'm just going to throw in, that I've always, as I've said before, made the comment that beware of simple solutions to difficult problems. And recently, when I say recently, in the last few years, there was a book that came out called The Cause of All Cancers, and it was written by a lady who was actually had a PhD in research, and then she became a naturopath, and eventually they hounded her around this country till she left and went to Mexico and opened a clinic. Her name was Hulda Clark, and she wrote a book called The Cause of All Cancers. And in her book, she was pushing very heavily that all cancer is caused by a parasite. That would be very simple if that were the case. All you have to do is get rid of the parasite and everything is fine. But in my mind, it was an oversimplification. Now, I read her book, and as I read through the book, it became apparent to me that she really wasn't getting tremendous results with it. I'm not saying that whatever therapy she was doing didn't get some results with some people, because every therapy that you can think of for cancer, somebody is going to be helped with it, and they're going to claim that that's the way that everybody should be helped. And that happens a lot of times. So I'm not saying that there weren't any people that went to see her and followed this protocol for this parasite, that some of them didn't get better. However, the book that I read, as I went to her cases illustrating, either they never finished and they left, or they died, or they were still being treated, but I didn't see, at least from my observation from reading the book and her case presentations, that that her therapy was highly effective based on the theory that a parasite caused it. Then later she tended to kind of get into organic toxins and other things, so she began to spread it out. But at the very beginning, the whole cause it was all this parasite that she thought she had isolated, and if you kill the parasite, then everything is great. Getting back to a la Pasteur, one germ or one cause, one disease, one cure. Anyhow, it didn't work that way, and I'm not saying she didn't help some people, which I'm sure she did. And as I say, if people went down there believing that this was the answer and they followed what she taught, they would get better. But as I looked into some of the things she did, it became apparent that she was doing more than just trying to get rid of the parasites. She was doing other things too. So even though she would have said that was the cause, it ended up that she was doing a much more comprehensive treatment than just trying to get rid of the parasite. So, you know, I have seen several books out there that do that claim this is the one thing that causes all diseases, because that's eventually where she went to, Hulda Clark. She actually said the cause of all diseases, period, after she started out with the first book, The Cause of All Cancers. Then she got into AIDS, and then it was all diseases and so forth. And I'm not poo-pooing her work, because some of the things she did were interesting and could be useful, especially on the contamination of food and detoxing food and a lot of other things that she came up with. Those were all good pieces of information. So anyhow, the nutritional deficiency has, from the time I've been in natural medicine, kind of the beginning level. Then this parasite thing came along. Another one that became pretty prevalent along the way and still is hanging out there is called the ROTS theory, R-O-T-S, which stands for reactive oxygen toxic species, or oxidizers, or what today are commonly referred to as free radicals. In other words, the free radical theory of cancer. Now again, this is a single cause type of thing, And it's not necessarily based on an absence of oxygen. It's based on the overproduction of free radicals about oxygen that ended up not having enough antioxidants to take care of. In other words, this is where people said, okay, the real cause is of all these free radicals. And there's a lot of them. You usually only hear of a couple, three, but there's probably at least maybe a dozen major free radicals that can form. And different things are necessary to deal with each type. For example, there's such a thing as what's called a superoxide radical, or free radical, which means it's missing electrons, and it attempts to steal electrons from whatever it comes in contact with. And when it does that, in the process, it damages whatever tissue or molecules that it steals the electrons from, and can cause trouble. Now, more often, superoxide is an intracellular free radical, but it could be exterior in the blood or in the lymph and so forth, and even in the bowel tract or the gastric tract in general. So consequently, these free radicals of various types have all formed, and so some people have sold products and say, well, this has extremely high free radical capability, therefore it's going to get rid of cancer. Because cancer is caused by free radicals. So it gets back to the idea that whatever your theory is, then you look for some therapy that's going to deal with that theory. Whether or not it does it is a different story, but at least that's the theory. And as I say, there's probably a dozen major free radicals, things like hydrogen peroxide. So anyhow, I mentioned superoxide. So what takes care of a superoxide free radical is an enzyme, actually. And the enzyme is called superoxide dismutase, or SOD for short. So that can help actually neutralize a superoxide free radical. But on the other hand, certain processes in the body produce hydrogen peroxide as a byproduct, which is also a powerful oxidizer. But SOD does not affect that. So the body generates another enzyme for that called catalase. And so catalase is important inside the cells and outside the cells, along with the SOD, to neutralize hydrogen peroxide and superoxide radicals. But there's other kinds of oxidizers that those two enzymes will not do anything with. They require some other type. Now, I mentioned about selenomethionine, and selenium is a antioxidant intracellularly. And its job is to neutralize certain types of free radicals that occur within a cell by donating electrons. And so if you look at the picture, actually ROTS, ROTS, or free radical damage, is a real issue. It's not that it's not an issue. The question is it capable of producing cancer? Because bottom line is, we're talking about what are theories that cause cancer. Now, the same people who say that the free radicals are a problem for cancer also say that it's a problem in aging. And so you will see a lot of material out there that talks about taking care of free radicals to act as an anti-aging procedure or treatment so that you stay young longer. Because, one guy I know out of Chicago area, he kind of uses the chemical name that when something is oxidized, it rusts. Like steel, for example, if it's oxidized, it turns into iron oxide, which is rust. And so he calls it body rust when you have too many free radicals affecting your body, and therefore you need to do something to offset those. But as I say, it's not that simple. You need vitamin E, which is another antioxidant. You need vitamin C, which is another antioxidant. You need beta-carotene, which is another antioxidant. And what you will find actually is, if you study biochemistry and pathology, etc., you will find that there's different types of antioxidants. You either have a preference for certain tissue or locations in the body, and a preference for certain types of free radicals. And so, if you start from the skin going inward, we're talking about beta-carotene, protecting the cells at the skin level against free radical damage. And in that case, it can be that ultraviolet happens to be one of the oxidizers that breaks apart or damages the cells. And so beta carotene works good for that, but it doesn't work in other areas for other types of things. And we have within the body, before you get to a cell and in an organ, you have to, first of all, get nutrients out of the bloodstream. It has to move through a filler tissue called the matrix, which is a combination of what's called mesenchyme tissue and fibers, a lot of connective tissue fibers. And so those are present, and this nutrients have to go through that. Then they come up to a barrier called the basement membrane, they have to get across that. Well, the basement membrane is protected by vitamin C, which is going to neutralize a lot of free radicals coming through the basement membrane headed toward the cells. Okay, but once it gets past that, then it has to go through the cell membrane of the individual cells that make up, for example, a liver. And so those cell walls are protected by vitamin E, which is also an antioxidant. So each of those protect different barriers or walls or tissues that separate or differentiate, and try to cut down the amount coming through those, and that's their purpose. So as I say, there's a lot of rationale for nutritional deficiencies being a problem, and there's a lot of rationale for the free radical problem being a problem. So it's not that it's not a problem, but just providing a lot of antioxidants does not necessarily take care of cancer. But those people who believe that are very heavy in using antioxidant therapies. Now, the other one that is a biggie that you have to follow it over a long period of time, and this is called the pleomorphic theory or concept. And it's really more than a theory. There is a pleomorphic organism of a sort. And I'm saying of a sort because it's quite intriguing how it manifests itself and how it works and what its purpose is. Now, we can go back and trace it to a key player who was contemporary with Pasteur, and this researcher's name was Antoine Béchamp. Now, I've mentioned him before. In the late 1900s, right around the turn of the century, he wrote a book called Blood and Its Third Anatomical Element. And so that is available. It's available through Amazon, and it should be on our book list. If it's not, why, we'll make sure that it is there. But it's a good book to read because he's one of the first people that at least can find record of that had observed this. You know, back then it was thought there were only two types of cells in the blood, red cells and white cells. And so when he discovered this other element, which he called a third anatomical element, he named it microzyma. He thought it was some kind of an enzyme, and that it was present, and that it was actually present in the ground and could hang on for centuries and was almost indestructible, at least in certain stages. And so he hypothesized that this had something to do with the health and sickness of the body. He didn't carry it on, and he did heavily for what he was capable of doing. Back then, they did not have high-powered microscopes and a lot of things, so he observed a lot about this, even though he didn't have many powerful tools to deal with it. Now, the interesting thing is that Pasteur became aware of it, but he kind of ignored the whole thing, and if he did present it, he did it in a way that was not what Béchamp had found out. And then, of course, he did steal some other ideas from Béchamp, who was a medical researcher, trained as a doctor and a medical researcher. And I have to say that Pasteur was a chemist, but he was certainly not trained in medicine or medical research of any kind. He was not a physician, but you would think by the way Pasteur had been held up by medicine that he was a great physician. Actually, when you get back and study his background, you're going to find that there was a lot of detrimental things happened with him and with his vaccines that he developed, and got him in big trouble in more cases than not. However, for some reason, people just love this idea: one germ, one disease, and one treatment. And except today they don't do one treatment anymore. They want to give you multiple treatments, even though they try to say that there's one cause. At any rate, it ended up that Béchamp, for years, studied these microzymas, and finally, as I say, at later years, he had it published into a book, The Blood and Its Third Anatomical Element, and it's a good book to read. Now, there was a German researcher by the name of Gunther Enderlein, and he evidently picked up on Béchamp's work, and in the 1900s, he started looking into it heavily. By then, they had better microscopes, and there was a lot of things going on. And so Enderlein took it to another level. He was able to show that these, whatever they were, these units that were in the blood, that were referred to by Béchamp as microzyma, that they were actually a type of pleomorphic life form. Pleomorphic means have many forms. And so he at some point established what he called was a whole cycle of about around 17 different forms that formed the circle. They could start from a dot that was almost invisible to see, almost like a virus, and they could develop over time in the blood to higher and higher forms. They could at some point look like a coccobacterial form, like a sphere. They could then look like a rod type, and eventually they could look like a fungus. And so Enderlein, for some reason, wanted something to pin illness on, which a lot of the doctors are looking for. And so since he found it in the blood, and found it sometimes actually inside red cells, that he figured as the person's blood got sicker or more toxic, that these forms changed their form. In other words, they went from one form to another and kept going until the final form, which was going to contribute to your death. And so he thought they were non-toxic to begin with, but as they increased, and he called it valences, as it increased in valence, it went to different forms that were larger, and he felt at some point these innocuous forms, whatever they did, and he wondered, and I know that Béchamp thought that they contributed to helping protect the body and the body function, which I'm sure that that's really what they're doing. But the difference is, I don't believe that they ever become pathogenic. I believe they continue to do what they do as your body gets sicker, and when the body dies, they revert to a fungal form, which breaks down the body and takes it back to dust. Now, I believe it was Enderlein that named this form, when it got to the fungal state, mucorrhesmosis. Now, it appears that its function is to break down the body so that it goes back to the dust. And if you look at mummies from Egypt, they've been able to find this form in those mummies and the old corpses, or corpses that have been buried in the ground. And as I say, they called it mucorrhesmosis. And so Enderlein became convinced that at some point in the transition or the morphing of this organism, that it changed from being friendly to the body to being the enemy of the body and then was a cause of disease. In my mind, after studying him and Béchamp and the others that we're going to mention, I have come to the conclusion that it never becomes pathogenic, that it does what it always does, is it works with the body where the body is. And now if the body's at the point of dying, then it reverts to a form that's going to break down the body and turn it back to dust in the ground. So I don't see it as ever becoming pathogenic. I'm seeing it as being purpose-directed to do what is needed to be done. Now, there's some interesting characteristics about it. I don't think we'll have time to cover that today, but we will next time. We'll take up there. But there's another thing about it, and I think it has to do with the expression of DNA and even altering DNA. And I think it's probably capable of that. I don't know why not. In certain forms, or certain of the valences or shapes that it takes on, that it's able to do that. Now, as an aside, a few years ago, Scientific American had an article, and I have it in my archives, I don't have it currently with me right here that I can read it to you, but a researcher who was doing some centrifuging of the blood, and to centrifuge means to put a sample in a small tube in this high-speed machine that spins it around and around and around at higher and higher speed, and in an ultra-centrifuge it's going at tremendously high speed. So what it does, the gravity separates the different substances that are in a liquid into layers depending on how heavy they are. Well, normally, most people, when they're doing blood studies, don't use an ultracentrifuge. They use just a normal centrifuge that will spin it down to a certain degree. But when you increase the speed and run it longer, you will begin to separate out into fine layers lots of different things inside the blood. Well, this one researcher was talking about, he was doing some research in this article, and he had occasion to spin the blood down with this ultracentrifuge for a long period of time, and when he took the sample out, he noted in the sample there was a layer that he'd never noticed before. And when he pipetted this layer out and looked at it under a microscope, he found a little unit in the blood he'd never seen before. In this case, they were little spheres, and he'd never seen anything like that before, and he wondered what it was. Well, he decided to do some testing on it, and he found that it had a modified form of the Krebs cycle, that it could convert nutrients into energy, but he couldn't find a purpose for it. He didn't know what it was for, and it was not in any of the microbiology books, because these forms, even though they're visible, are not in any microbiology books. And so he named it a microbody, for a lack of a better word. And I haven't heard a whole lot more. Just recently, as I was doing the search, I found a few instances referring to some microbodies, but still there's not a lot known about it. But I think he found one of those forms in the different steps that they can go through in their morphology. But they don't have any idea what the purpose of it was. I believe it has something to do with genetics, and can alter the genetics, the same as now they have found that RNA can actually act as on DNA and shift genes from one place to another, which are called transposons, and that certain molecules of RNA can go back and actually rewrite code in the DNA, and these are called retrotransposons. So it's interesting what is being discovered. In fact, it's mind-boggling when you get into it, what is really going on today. It's tremendously good in my mind, because there's a lot of information being gained, and they're finding out all kinds of things they didn't know before. But at any rate, they discovered this, but they didn't know what to do with it, and so, as I say, there's been a little bit written about it, and I've been watching, but I haven't found anything tremendous. But I would say that Enderlein was one of those who took Béchamp's work and went off in a certain direction. Now we're going to find that in this country, there was a researcher by the name of Royal Rife who, from another direction, found something in the blood. And we're going to find that Wilhelm Reich, who was an MD psychiatrist from Austria, worked contemporary with Freud for a while, and then they parted. Reich discovered it, and he gave it a different name, the same as Reich did. And that not along the way, a French researcher by the name of Gaston Neesens, who came over from France to Canada, did a lot of research, and he's the one that did something about the DNA I was going to tell you about, and I will when we talk about it next time. So Gaston Neesens found it, and he gave it a different name. And another cancer researcher and therapist, a doctor out in California for many years, Virginia Livingston Wheeler, she also discovered it, and she gave it another name, progenitor cryptosides. So we got all these names referring to something which is apparently the same thing. And in any of the cases, my personal feeling is that they didn't really understand it, and a lot of them were not familiar with somebody else's work. At least if they did, they didn't acknowledge it. They weren't talking about it. Except for Enderlein did acknowledge that Béchamp had started to work, and he had picked up on Béchamp's work. But Reich thought he had found something entirely different, which he called the BX virus. Reich found something, he called it the T. bacillus, and Neesens called it the somatids, and if I recall, Enderlein called them protids. And then Virginia Livingston Wheeler called it progenitor cryptosides. So we've got all these different names, and I think mucoracimosis may have come from Enderlein also. So anyhow, we have all the names referring to the same thing, and they're all saying, well, it makes the body sicker as these forms mutate or morph into more advanced forms, and at some point they become pathogenic, and those are the cause of illness, and therefore you have to deal with those if you want to get someone well. And so the advanced stages of the pleomorph are supposedly the ones involved with cancer, just so you know how we bring that in to this whole issue. So if you accept that that's the case, then you're going to say, okay, then our treatment is going to have to address these pleomorphs, or the whatever you want to call them, from the different names that they've been given, which I believe when you read the descriptions, you're reading all about the same thing. And you will find it interesting that if it were that simple, that here this is the one thing you have to deal with, and that'll take care of everything. And in actual practice, it doesn't work that way either. It's not that simple. It may be one part of a complex therapy program, but just dealing with the pleomorphs is not the answer. Now, we've got some other things that we will be talking about that are considered as part of this cancer problem. And once we've covered the basic ideas or theories about causes of cancer, then we'll start talking about some of the therapies and why probably each person who has cancer needs a bit of a different therapy, because there's a lot of reasons why they have it, and therefore you have to deal with the uniqueness of that person over someone else, so that you can't have a standard protocol and say, if everybody does this, then it's going to be great. Or you could be doing that and do like medicine and subject everybody to basically surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation and hope for the best. It doesn't work for them, and it wouldn't work for natural therapy to do it that way. So I hope you've enjoyed where we've come to up to this point, giving you some ideas that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Now, I did want to throw in one thing. I mentioned it before, real fast, before we end up here. We had mentioned earlier that Dr. Warburg's research, Otto Warburg, had been known about and accepted by both traditional or standard medicine and alternative medicine. And hardly anything has been done with that, because, again, I'm sure it doesn't require, if they were addressing that, it wouldn't require expensive, extensive therapies, and therefore not a lot of interest in it. However, I did run across a recent 2007 research article called Chronic Cancer Hypoxia is the Prime Cause of Cancer. What is the deoxygenating role of adulterated and improper ratios of polyunsaturated fatty acids when incorporated into cell membranes? What does that mean? It means that if the cell membranes are defective because of improper fatty acids, it can impair the ability of oxygen to cross those membranes, not only to the exterior cell wall, but the cell walls of the mitochondria in the cells where the energy is actually made and the oxygen is actually utilized. The people who did this research said, despite 50 years of intensive cancer research, increasingly focused on genetic causes, no single unifying cause for cancer has been established. Although it is well known that tumors are hypoxic, and that there is a correlation between the level of hypoxia and prognosis, with the exception of Warburg studies, little work has been done to investigate the relationship between hypoxia and cancer. As I said, I don't think it was going to lead, the way it was looking, to extensive therapeutic models, and therefore there was no big interest in pursuing it. Modern biochemistry acknowledges that there is a switch from oxidative phosphorylation to glycolysis in tumors that might be concurrent with hypoxia, but does not address the cancer causation. And what these people are saying is that they think that if it gets down to the critical 35% reduction in intracellular oxygen levels, that the cancer can be initiated, and that they think defective membranes because of bad fatty acids are the problem. And they're talking specific about polyunsaturated oils or fatty acids, which are the common vegetable oils that are plugged for everybody because of the so-called cholesterol issue, and saturated fatty acids. We don't have time to get into that in detail, but as we talk about the therapies, we'll be telling you something about that and the right fatty acid for the cell membrane. At any rate, we've come to the end of another broadcast, so we want you to go to our website, alternativehealthcast.com, and there you can click to our broadcasts. The new one goes up every Sunday at 4 o'clock, and you can also click to our alternative health and prevention from our Mind Your Healthcast site. And you also find there's new information on there about our weight loss, which is a new program that I put together, initiating a lot of new ideas brought together, and that it's designed to not only help you lose weight but to keep it off. I think you'll find it interesting, and that information is there, as well as many other things if you peruse our site. It was nice to be with you again, and I hope you enjoy the broadcast, and I'll be looking forward to be with you this next week with the new broadcast. Otherwise, we want you to be healthy.